When we left off in the last lecture, we were talking about how we are now transitioning into a new decade. It's the end of Eisenhower's presidency. It's the end of a time where we have a full decade behind us after World War II. But it's an interesting time because it's not just the end of any old decade, right? This is a time where there's a younger generation that's really pushing back against this idea of having to fit into a specific box of expectations of what life is like, supposed to be like for an American, and who an American is supposed to be, how Americans are supposed to identify themselves, right? And it's challenging this idea that Americans are supposed to behave in certain specific ways, and that's how they identify themselves as loyal, patriotic Americans. And so with that mentality, with that sort of tension in the air, we enter into the 1960s. And so with the 1960s, in November of 1960, you see the election of John F. Kennedy, but you also see the emergence of a new phase of the Civil Rights Revolution. And so I want to start with that because there had been some changes that were in place, taking place in 1960 itself, prior to John F. Kennedy's election. And so I want to talk about that kind of in chronological order so that way you know how we're ushering in the new decade. So I want to talk about civil rights primarily because you start to see a shift in who's getting involved. This is not to say that Martin Luther King Jr. and his peers are still not involved. They are heavily involved. They are still seen as the faces and the voice of the movement. But in 1960, you see the emergence of college-age students becoming involved in the movement. So in 1960, a group of students in North Carolina decide to step up and participate in what is known as sit-ins. Now, sit-ins had been a protest movement, a protest type of strategy dating back to Mahatma Gandhi in India, going back to the 1940s. So this has been something that's been in practice widely. But when we talk about what happens in 1960, what happens there is that these college students go to a popular diner. It starts with 4 students, and at this sit-in, they go to a diner, they sit, and the idea is they would not speak to anyone unless they were spoken to, and when they are spoken to, it has to be someone who asks them what their order will be. What happens instead is people are telling them they have to leave, but they don't leave. They stay, they remain in their seats until they are arrested and forced out, right? What I want you to understand is that in these restaurants, in these diners, African Americans are able to access business to these places. However, they would have to pick up their food at the back of the restaurant. So in the alleys or wherever the back door was, usually by the kitchen, that's where they would pick up their food. They were never allowed to eat within the diner itself. There could not be mixed race seating inside of the diner. And so what they were challenging was this idea that if we are paying customers just like our white counterparts, we should be able to eat in the same restaurant. And so what started to happen is in North Carolina, more and more students started to join into this movement. As more students started to join, there was a lot more violence that started to happen. More patrons started to come in, and what they would do is verbally taunt these protesters. They would pour ketchup and mustard, soda all over them. Some of these students, some of these protesters were pulled off of the stools, beaten, and the protesters were instructed not to do anything against anyone who was attacking them. Instead, you could protect yourself, so cover your head, roll up in a ball to protect your body and protect yourself as much as possible, but you do not fight back. That's the point. There's no fighting back involved in sit-ins. The whole purpose of this was to draw attention, right, to what is going on, the unfair treatment of what's happening in these places of businesses, right? Now, and of course, the argument from these businesses is we should be able to choose whoever that we want to serve. But for Black patrons, this is a huge difficulty, right? Because these people are serving them, but they're serving them in a second-class way, right? They're taking Black money, but not serving Black people equally. That's the difference. So in the meantime, when police arrive, which they always do, the police always arrest the protesters and not those people who were attacking the protesters, because the protesters are seen as the ones who are causing the trouble. Another way that young people start getting involved is, and this is directly connected to the sit-in movement, is they form their own civil rights organization. The largest civil rights organization that is created is the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, also known as SNCC for short. Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee is going to be established by a group of college students, including the late John Lewis, who would later become a representative from Georgia, and who passed away in 2020. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee is exactly that. They organize nonviolent protests throughout the South. And I want you to keep in mind that they are not the only student civil rights organization, but they are the largest. This SNCC would include Black and white students. They are as young as 18 and well into their 20s. And then there are other people who will get involved in different ways. SNCC will also be involved and work with other students to challenge or to test out federal laws that basically said that African Americans should be able to have equal access to the transit system. So let me explain what's going on here. Now we're into Kennedy's presidency in 1961, and a federal law is passed, and there is a judicial ruling to verify this, that buses and bus stations across the country must be integrated. So of course that includes the South. But of course it's one thing for a court to say that. It's another thing for that to actually be enforced, right? And we know this from, Brown v. Board of Education. So what these students decide to do is college students and even a couple of professors decide to test out whether or not bus stations and buses were actually abiding by those rulings. So they get onto a bus starting in just north of Virginia, and they travel through the South. And as you can see from the bottom right picture, one of those buses is attacked. In fact, it was pulled over in one spot, and as it was pulled over in one spot, the tires were slashed, so the bus was able to travel just a little bit further. The bus driver is called out. He sees the mob around them, and of course he tries to escape with his life. You can't blame him for that. And then as these students are, hoping that help will come, they're hunkering down in the bus, and then somebody throws in a firebomb basically, and forces these students out. As they come out of the bus, they are beaten, and beaten with batons, beaten with, whatever these people can come out with. there's one guy who is beaten so badly, but he sees a police officer there, and the police officer is literally just standing there watching this happen until this man who has been beaten clings to the police officer. He wraps his arm around him almost as if he's just begging for help. And so the police officer immediately shoots a gun in the air and basically says, okay, that's enough now. You've all had enough. And the interesting thing here is, there's only one young girl there who's going back and forth from a little store nearby and bringing water for everyone. Just one young girl, that's it. Nobody else is helping. They're all just sort of standing around. If even that, everybody else kind of goes. There are, again, black and white students. And here's the thing. One of the rules, the sitting rules in the South, is that blacks have to sit in the back of the bus, whites have to sit in the front of the bus. But on this particular bus, blacks were sitting in the front and whites were sitting in the back. There are other rules as well. So, for example, when we talk about ambulances, an ambulance was called, but the law there had basically said that a white ambulance can only take white patients to the white hospital. They could not carry any black patients, and they could not take black patients to a white hospital. Then the black ambulance comes, and the black ambulance is only allowed to take black patients to the black hospital. So this is the conundrum. And when the white ambulance shows up, because the police officer there says, okay, at the very least, take these white students, these black people here can wait. Take these white students. And one of the white protesters says, well, if these black protesters aren't taken to the hospital, I'm not going. None of us are going. So the compromise was under the police officer's orders, and this takes a while because he's got to talk to other people, he's got to talk to superior officers. The compromise was that the black ambulance was allowed to take the both white and black students, but the white students could not be treated at the black hospital. They had to be treated elsewhere. The insanity of this, right? It's the insanity of the entire situation. But that's the point. That is exactly the point. They wanted to point out the insanity. They wanted to point out how bizarre it was at every possible level. And it's not just about pointing out the insanity to the rest of the country. The real goal here is to bring this attention to the Kennedy administration. What I want you to understand is John F. Kennedy is not a civil rights activist. This is a guy from Massachusetts who, while he does say a few things here and there on behalf of civil rights, he recognizes that civil rights is a major issue. He'll, reach out to Martin Luther King Jr. a couple of times here and there. So he'll make some public addresses about it. He's not a guy who prioritizes civil rights. That's not his thing. And so what happens as a result of the Freedom Riders is it forces the Kennedy administration to start to pay attention, because initially they don't get it. They don't understand why these students are going to all this trouble to test whether or not these laws are being enforced. To them, to the Kennedys, to the entire administration, they think, listen, if the law is on the books, then why do we need to test these things out? Why is this all necessary? And what these students are pointing out is that this is not enough, that having laws on books are not enough. You have to see the real injustice. And that's a real moment of clarity for not only John F. Kennedy, the president, but also his brother, Robert F. Kennedy. Robert F. Kennedy was serving as the Attorney General at that time. And Robert Kennedy is also the same sort of way. He doesn't realize how bad, how desperate the situation is until this moment. And that's a key moment for the Kennedy administration. Another significant moment is the realization of how violent things will be. But this is not just for the Kennedys, this is going to be for the rest of the country. And that's the emergence of visuals from the city of Birmingham, Alabama, which is nicknamed Bombingham. So Birmingham, Alabama, from the years 1947 to 1965, is nicknamed Bombingham because there are over 50 bombings that take place in that city. And the 50 bombings take place in Black neighborhoods and Black churches, Black businesses and Black neighborhoods are specifically targeted. And one of the things that you should know is that, of course, the people guilty of these bombings are never arrested, never thrown in jail, nobody's held accountable. And in the meantime, the people who lose their homes, the people who lose their businesses don't get any kind of compensation for it. Their insurance does not cover their losses. And so we're not just talking about the emotional trauma of losing lives, losing limbs, and losing homes like that. We're also talking about the financial trauma of it because they don't recover, they don't get any money back from it. It is specifically targeting Black neighborhoods and Black businesses. And so as a result, that's the nickname given to Birmingham. And that's why Birmingham is the most violent city in the South. It is incredibly dangerous to be a civil rights activist in Birmingham. And I should also add, Birmingham has a lead police officer named Eugene Connor, whose nickname was Bull, who publicly makes these comments about how the violence in the city is really the fault, the responsibility of its Black residents. So I want to talk about why this is significant, because it really comes to a head close to the end of John F. Kennedy's tenure as president in September of 1963, when a bomb goes off on Sunday morning in September of 1963 at 16th Street Baptist Church. Sunday morning, of course, is when all of these churches are getting together. But on this specific Sunday morning, it was Youth Sunday. So there had been a lot of young people gathered together early that morning, and then there had been a break in between, leading to waiting for the main service, and then a bomb goes off. And so I'd like for you to watch this explanation of what takes place that day.
It was the oldest Black church in Birmingham, and it was fairly large. And so it made sense that meetings would happen there, which would also make it a target. On Sunday morning, September 15th, it was Youth Day, right after Sunday school. Addie Mae Collins, Carol Robertson, Denise McNair, and Cynthia Wesley are getting ready to go into the choir.
I remember Addie, I was closest to Addie. We would go to church picnics. Addie and I just gravitated to each other.
Cynthia Wesley was a friend of mine. She was at my school. She was a 9th grader. Just started in September, and I was an 11th grader.
I remember Denise back there always smiling, and she was the only child. And I remember Carol Robinson being quiet. She played in the orchestra at her school.
Addie Mae's sister Sarah is also in that ladies' lounge. Sarah said the last thing that she remembers is seeing them helping each other tie on sashes, and then it went dark. We're talking about an explosion that reverberates through the entire city of Birmingham. Everybody heard it.
I was at South Illerton Baptist Church, and our pastor was shifting kind of nervously across the room and said he had received word that 16th Street Baptist Church had been bombed.
I was in Sunday school class. The building seemed like it was shaking off its foundation. Fumes, smelling fumes, and getting hit in the head. I couldn't find my younger sister. Only later to find out that she was taken to the hospital. She was only before. And she was cut in the head, blood dripping down her clothes and down her face.
Reverend John Cross comes down after the explosion to go into the hole and hears moaning.
My father heard somebody saying, Addie, Addie, and he realized that Sarah was calling her sister's name because that's the last voices that she heard before the explosion occurred.
They find the bodies and they're almost literally stacked on top of each other.
He said they looked like they had been blown together.
It devastated me. It was just so painful to know that these girls were killed at church. They had not done anything to deserve something like that.
That was enough to pull people off the fence. Kids are supposed to be safe at church. This is not supposed to happen in America. We're above this kind of thing. And so this was the catalyst to get some things moving.
So when we talk about the importance of this moment, right? It's something that gains the attention not just of the Kennedy administration, because they had been, the administration had been working on different bills, different legislative proposals, and that sort of thing to directly address what was going on in the South and really across the country concerning civil rights, and we'll get into that in a few minutes. But really, this is something that gets the attention of people across the country. And the fact that this level of violence is not directly addressed by local authorities is particularly troubling, right? One of the things that I told you about in the previous lecture on the early years of the Cold War, and even in the last, and even in this last sort of setup about how Americans are dealing with communism, one of the side effects, or one of the sort of unseen results of not dealing with the civil rights issue is the fact that the Soviet Union is going to use stories like this and going to use images like this as a part of their own campaign to their own people and abroad, and basically say, is this what democracy is supposed to be? Is this what we're supposed to believe is the great strength of democracy? Look at how they treat their own people. Look at how they deal with their own citizens. There are children that are dying, that are murdered, and nobody is held accountable for these things. That sort of thing is published in flyers, in leaflets, and pamphlets throughout Europe, and it's something that Kennedy also holds on to, because one of the things that he prioritizes, just like his predecessors, is this fight against communism, and this issue with civil rights is just not going away. So when we talk about John F. Kennedy, I want to talk about him and how he compares to the guys who have come before him, especially because John F. Kennedy is the first president born in the 20th century. And so because of that, he is seen as really the face and the real representation of a new generation that's taking over as leaders in the country, right? So here's a guy who was born in 1917, and he takes over as the 35th president, and he is the youngest man at that time, the youngest man ever sworn in as president of the United States. And he has a very young family, right? A young, beautiful family at that, right? So Jacqueline Kennedy is seen as this beautiful, artistic, worldly wife, and their young, adorable children. So it's this idealistic time where a young family moves into the White House and represents a new generation of leadership. And so And so does the rest of his administration, right? It's all members of this generation, except for his vice president. His vice president is Lyndon Johnson. And I just want to tell you that now because I don't want you to forget that Lyndon Johnson is very different in that he is, even though he's born in 1908, so, only like he's less than a decade older than John F. Kennedy, Johnson is seen as much older. Johnson has way more experience, especially at the federal level, but way more political experience than John F. Kennedy, right? So he's really the old guy in this administration. Everybody else is very young, in their 30s, early 40s, if even that. And they're young and vigorous and have new visions for America. And so with that, Kennedy names his vision for America the New Frontier. And what he's trying to do is essentially say to the United States, say to the American people, that it is time that we lead the United States, lead this country into a new century, like thinking about the future, thinking about what's next, right? And he is fully embracing this American belief, this American value that Americans have always been explorers and adventurers and wanting to conquer that which hasn't been conquered, right? And so for a good example of this is for Kennedy, is Kennedy fully embraces the idea of space travel. This is not brand new. In the 1950s, as Russia launches its first satellite, Sputnik, which I briefly mentioned in the previous lecture, that's something that the Americans have been embracing as well. But Kennedy is really pushing it forward. Kennedy says, this is not just something that we should think about or something we should compete with the Russians. This is something that we should genuinely think about and explore and try. He's pushing for missions that are include men and women. It's that include the goal of putting a man on the moon. He's the guy who really sort of leads the way on that. So when he talks about the new frontier, he's not just talking about an America that is led by a new generation. He is talking about an America that looks forward into the future, right? He is thinking about an America that's going into not just the rest of this century, the rest of the 20th century. He wants to think forward into the 21st century. Okay. Now, all of that sounds ideal, right? Because here's this new generation taking over as leadership. But the problem is that Kennedy brings a lot of inexperience into this job. And as a result, he's not really using a whole lot of new understanding in this position, right? So his priority, just like Eisenhower, just like Truman, is going to be fighting communism. And on the one hand, you understand it because, as Eisenhower says, this has to be the main goal. Fighting communism, you always have to be at a level of preparedness. On the other hand, Kennedy doesn't quite understand what that preparedness should look like and doesn't quite understand what that's going to mean. So early on in his presidency, and by early on, I mean by month 4, he authorizes what is known as the Bay of Pigs invasion. So let me explain what's going on. A few years before Kennedy takes over, so in the 1950s, Cuba had become a communist country. And Cuba is a teeny tiny island just 90 miles away from Florida, 90 miles away from Key West, Florida. And the thing about that is when people are at an all-time panic about the spread of communism, and then they hear that, there is a communist country just 90 miles away, of course they're freaking out. They're completely panicking, and everybody's worried about how this is going to implode, how this is going to spread to the United States. Immediately after Fidel Castro takes over as their communist leader, there are thousands of Cuban refugees who come to the United States seeking asylum, right? So a large number of Cuban residents in Florida can date their residency, their parents, their grandparents having come over during that time period as a result of trying to escape Fidel Castro. So during the Eisenhower administration, there are questions of, okay, is there a way that we can remove Castro from power? This is a tiny island. Surely they can't handle the strength of the United States. Maybe there's a way that we can replace this guy. So the CIA presents a plan to Eisenhower of this idea that, well, we can train these Cuban exiles in a military way. We can train them how to fight. We can train them how to be spies. And then we can send them in back to Cuba and they can lead a revolution to overthrow Fidel Castro. And Eisenhower says, that's idiotic. I'm not doing it. Because Eisenhower, remember, is a general. And not only is he a general, but one of the things that makes him such a great general and so effective is that he is a strategist. So he is one of the main strategists behind D-Day, for example, of June 6, 1944. He is looking at this plan that the CIA presents him, and he says, this is never going to work because, one, these are not military trained operatives. These are just a bunch of guys who escaped Cuba randomly. And just because they hate Castro doesn't mean that they can overthrow Castro. Secondly, if we're going to do something like this, it's going to need military support. And I'm not going to do that. I'm not authorizing that. So with that, the plan dies until Kennedy steps in. When Kennedy steps in, the CIA tries the plan with him, and he okays it because he thinks this is doable. The CIA manages to convince him, and he says, sure. What ends up happening, though, is exactly what Eisenhower predicts will happen. So it's called the Bay of Pigs because these Cuban exiles, are, after they're trained and whatever, are sent in to invade through what is known as the Bay of Pigs in Cuba. But Cuban authorities literally see these men coming. So they're not taken by surprise. They know they're coming. And almost immediately, this revolution attempt is quelled. There's no chance that any kind of revolution is taking place. Most of these men are captured. Some of them are killed, and nothing comes of this. It is a huge international embarrassment to Kennedy because Kennedy. Here is the big bad United States, and with Kennedy, the brand new president, the brand new generational leader in charge, and they can't even take on this teeny tiny island of Cuba. And in the meantime, Fidel Castro says, oh my God, I have no idea what these Americans are going to do. Who am I going to call for help? He calls the Russians and he says, you need to start doing something. I need your help. Will you be my ally? Will you be my support? And of course, the Russians, because they hate the Americans, the Russians agree. So this turns into a catastrophe in all sorts of ways. So I want you to put a pin in that because we're going to come back to it in a moment. Later that year, John F. Kennedy goes to meet the Soviet premier, Nikita Khrushchev. Khrushchev, just so you know, is spelled Khrushchev, Khrushchev. Nikita Khrushchev and Kennedy meet in Germany. This is their first meeting. Kennedy wants to make a good impression, but in his impression, he wants to be the tough guy, just like Truman wanted to do all those years ago with Stalin, right? So Kennedy wants to make a really strong, tough guy impression that the Americans are no one to mess with, but especially that he's not the guy to mess with, right? Especially after this embarrassing moment in Cuba. So Kennedy really wants to make sure that Khrushchev knows who he's dealing with, and that Khrushchev knows that, Kennedy is not a fool and blah, blah, blah. Well, Khrushchev basically thinks this guy is making huge threats, and I'm going to have to protect our interests. And I don't know what this guy is going to do. I think Castro was right that, Kennedy is someone who's not stable. So I'm going to have to respond in kind. And what ends up happening is the city of Berlin. Hopefully, you remember this from the Cold War lecture. But remember, the city of Berlin is the capital city, or was the capital city of Germany. It was the industrial city of Germany, the industrial center of Germany, I should say. And it had been split between East Berlin and West Berlin. East Berlin had been under the control of Russia. West Berlin had been under the control of the United States, Great Britain, and France. In August of 1961, after John F. Kennedy leaves that meeting, Khrushchev is so angry that he orders the building of what will be known as the Berlin Wall. What you see on the bottom right there is the early parts of of the building of that wall. So the wall is basically two separate walls with this zone in the middle, and the wall was thick enough that soldiers could walk around, and of course these are all armed guards over there, and anyone who tried to escape East Berlin was immediately shot, if not at the very least detained, but of course others were shot if they tried to escape. The Berlin Wall becomes the physical representation of the Cold War. There's no communication between East Berlin and West Berlin. There's no connection between East Berlin and West Berlin. So families are split apart, friends are separated, and East Berlin is completely isolated from West Berlin for the first time ever. And this is even since World War II, after the agreement. Remember, after the war is over, even though Russia has control over East Berlin, you could travel freely as long as you had your identification on you. You could travel freely anywhere in the city. But now that the wall is there, you could not, right? It's just like the Iron Curtain that Churchill talked about, except now the Iron Curtain is real. It's an actual wall. The other thing that starts to happen is there is more talk of a threat of nuclear war, right? That Khrushchev is so angry after these meetings, and Kennedy is so angry after these meetings, that Americans are talking about building massive bunkers. In fact, there are magazine covers and news stories that talk about why we should be more invested in bunkers to protect ourselves from the threat of nuclear bombs. It's a very dangerous time. And when we talk about how it all sort of comes to a head, right? How it all sort of leads to this major, massive moment, that leads us to, that should actually say, that leads us to the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Cuban Missile Crisis is an incredibly pivotal moment in the Kennedy administration. So here's what ends up happening. In October of 1962, Kennedy is given satellite photographs in which he is told that the Russians had been building nuclear missile silos in Cuba so that eventually those silos could house nuclear bombs there. So the nuclear bombs weren't there already, but there were silos there so that they could have or hold bombs later on. So, of course, the Kennedy administration knows that trouble is on the way, right? That these guys are putting nuclear weapons there, and guessing on the number of silos that had been built, there were enough to blow away the entire eastern seaboard, if not, more. So what the United States does is Kennedy sends in the U.S. Navy to form a blockade around Cuba to prevent the Russians from sending in any more aid and any more weaponry, anything. So there's a huge naval blockade around Cuba. And the world is essentially at a standstill for 2 weeks. For nearly 2 weeks, the world believes that we are on the brink of nuclear war. And it is the closest we've ever been to an all-out nuclear war. Even when we talk about the United States involvement, the American involvement in nuclear war, this is really the closest that we get. Because it's not just about Cuba having the possibility of a nuclear weapon. It's the fact that the Americans and the Russians already have nuclear weapons, right? So what happens behind the scenes is, of course, nonstop negotiations of how we can end this peacefully. Now, of course, everybody's eyes, everybody's attention is on what's going on in and around Cuba. What a lot of people don't know or realize is that the people of Russia have had nuclear missiles pointed at them since the end of World War II. I hope you remember that a part of the Truman Doctrine and a part of the Marshall Plan was to rebuild Europe, right? That we were going to help freedom-loving peoples, right? So we were sending in money and helping to rebuild Europe. And a part of us rebuilding Europe, specifically Turkey, is we made a deal with the Turkish government that they would hold American nuclear missile silos holding actual nuclear warheads pointed at Moscow and other major cities of the Soviet Union. So for all of these years, there have been nuclear weapons pointed at the Russians, and we completely freaked out at the possibility of nuclear weapons pointed at the United States so close to us, right? So in these negotiations, what we agree to is if you don't arm those nuclear missile silos in Cuba, then we will make sure to disarm the nuclear missile silos in Turkey. And that's how this comes to an end. It takes 2 weeks, but that's how this comes to an end. The whole world is holding its breath. And finally, this is what ends it, right? What I want you to know, and what really matters here, I mean, that all of that is important, but what happens is Kennedy goes through what I like to call a paradigm shift. And what I mean by that is there's something that changes his perspective entirely. And what he realizes is he has to reconsider everything. It makes him realize how powerful the presidency really is. Here he is, a father of 2 young children who brings the entire world to the brink of nuclear war. He is partially responsible for that, right? And so he realizes in that moment that he has to change his approach to how he deals with this threat on communism. So I want you to hear a speech that he gives in June of 1963. This is just going to be a little snippet of what he says about communism and communists. So communism, the ideology, versus people who identify themselves as communists. And see if you can note the difference.
I have chosen this time and place to discuss a topic on which ignorance too often abounds and the truth too rarely perceived. And that is the most important topic on earth, peace. I speak of peace because of the new face of war. Total war makes no sense in an age where great powers can maintain large and relatively invulnerable nuclear forces and refuse to surrender without resort to those forces. It makes no sense in an age where a single nuclear weapon contains almost 10 times the explosive force delivered by all the Allied air forces in the Second World War. It makes no sense in an age when the deadly poisons produced by a nuclear exchange would be carried by wind and water and soil and seed to the far corners of the globe and to generations yet unborn. To secure these ends, high-level discussions will shortly begin in Moscow, looking towards early agreement on a comprehensive test ban treaty. To make clear our good faith and solemn convictions on this matter, I now declare that the United States does not propose to conduct nuclear tests in the atmosphere so long as other states do not do so. The United States, as the world knows, will never start a war. We do not want a war. We do not now expect a war. This generation of Americans has already had enough, more than enough, of war and hate and oppression. No government or social system is so evil that its people must be considered as lacking in virtue. As Americans, we find communism profoundly repugnant as a negation of personal freedom and dignity. But we can still hail the Russian people for their many achievements in science and space, in economic and industrial growth, in culture, in acts of courage. For in the final analysis, our most basic common link is that we all inhabit this small planet. We all breathe the same air. We all cherish our children's futures, and we are all mortal.
So this is obviously a very different Kennedy, right? And it's certainly a different Kennedy, especially when you compare him not only to the Kennedy of the early part of his term, but even to his predecessors, right? This is the Kennedy that a lot of people had hoped for and voted for. This is a guy who understands the threat of communism, and he very clearly says, as Americans, we do not agree with communism. We think communism is a terrible idea. There's nothing about communism that we like. However, here's what we're not going to do. What we're not going to do is contribute to creating or expanding on weaponry that's designed to destroy the planet. And we are not going to demean or dehumanize a people because they believe in a certain ideology, right? So he brings a certain level of humanity to communists, people who believe in the communist ideology. He says, listen, just like us, these are people who are breathing the same air. They are drinking water. They're trying to raise their children. They're trying to live day to day, month to month, year to year, just like we are. We just don't agree on how to do it. We don't agree on political ideologies and economic ideologies. That's the difference. That's a fundamental difference. But is that enough to justify Earth-destroying weaponry? No. That's a very different Kennedy, right? That's not the same Kennedy who met with Nikita Khrushchev just a couple of years before. The very next day, after Kennedy makes this speech at American University, he gives a speech from the White House. And in the speech from the White House, there are a couple of things going on in the background, just as context for you to understand. So the Kennedy administration for a year or so had been working on a civil rights bill. Now, keep in mind, he is not listening to his vice president, and his vice president, being the experienced legislator that he is giving great advice, but Kennedy's not listening because he thinks that he's got the better head on his shoulders. He does not. So they've been trying really hard to pass this civil rights bill. It hasn't been working. And then on top of that, you've had issues with students who've been trying to get admission into college in Mississippi and in Alabama and in different parts of the South. And this has been national news. That's on top of all of the things that have been happening, in the years before, for the freedom riders, the sit-ins, and that sort of thing. Again, movements that have been led by young people and that Martin Luther King Jr. would eventually follow up. That's important for you to remember because that's going to come back later on. So Kennedy decides that he is going to give a speech on civil rights and talk about the importance of civil rights in the United States. That's this next clip.
Good evening, my fellow citizens. This afternoon, following a series of threats and defiant statements, the presence of Alabama National Guardsmen was required on the University of Alabama to carry out the final and unequivocal order of the United States District Court of the Northern District of Alabama. That order called for the admission of two clearly qualified young Alabama residents who happened to have been born Negro. That they were admitted peacefully on the campus is due in good measure to the conduct of the students of the University of Alabama who met their responsibilities in a constructive way. I hope that every American, regardless of where he lives, will stop and examine his conscience about this and other related incidents. This nation was founded by men of many nations and backgrounds. It was founded on the principle that all men are created equal, and that the rights of every man are diminished when the rights of one man are threatened. Today we are committed to a worldwide struggle to promote and protect the rights of all who wish to be free. And when Americans are sent to Vietnam or West Berlin, we do not ask for whites only. It ought to be possible, therefore, for American students of any color to attend any public institution they select without having to be backed up by troops. It ought to be possible for American consumers of any color to receive equal service in places of public accommodation, such as hotels and restaurants and theaters and retail stores, without being forced to resort to demonstrations in the street. And it ought to be possible for American citizens of any color to register and to vote in a free election without interference or fear of reprisal. It ought to be possible, in short, for every American to enjoy the privileges of being American without regard to his race or his color. In short, every American ought to have the right to be treated as he would wish to be treated, as one would wish his children to be treated. But this is not the case. The Negro baby born in America today, regardless of the section of the state in which he is born, has about one-half as much chance of completing a high school as a white baby, born in the same place on the same day. One-third as much chance of completing college. One-third as much chance of becoming a professional man. Twice as much chance of becoming unemployed. About 1/7 as much chance of earning $10,000 a year. A life expectancy which is 7 years shorter, and the prospects of earning only half as much. This is not a sectional issue. Difficulties over segregation and discrimination exist in every city, in every state of the Union, producing in many cities a rising tide of discontent that threatens the public safety. Nor is this a partisan issue. In a time of domestic crisis, men of goodwill and generosity should be able to unite regardless of party or politics. This is not even a legal or legislative issue alone. It is better to settle these matters in the courts than on the streets, and new laws are needed at every level. But law alone cannot make men see right. We are confronted primarily with a moral issue. It is as old as the Scriptures and is as clear as the American Constitution. The heart of the question is whether all Americans are to be afforded equal rights and equal opportunities, whether we are going to treat our fellow Americans as we want to be treated. If an American, because his skin is dark, cannot eat lunch in a restaurant open to the public, if he cannot send his children to the best public school available, if he cannot vote for the public officials who represent him, if, in short, he cannot enjoy the full and free life which all of us want, then who among us would be content to have the color of his skin changed and stand in his place? Who among us would then be content with the counsels of patience and delay? 100 years of delay have passed since President Lincoln freed the slaves, yet their heirs, their grandsons, are not fully free. They are not yet freed from the bonds of injustice. They are not yet freed from social and economic oppression. And this nation, for all its hopes and all its boasts, will not be fully free until all its citizens are free.
So when we talk about the impact or the importance of Kennedy's speech there, and again, we only listened to 5.5 minutes of it there, he is addressing a couple of things, right? He looks at actual statistics to show people that this is what's actually happening, what it means to be a Black person in this country, that if you are a Black child born in this country, what it means to grow up Black, trying to get a job as a Black person, trying to get a house as a Black person. And he says this is not just a Southern issue. This is not just something that happens in the South. This happens nationwide, right? So he is identifying this as an American problem, not a Southern problem. But then he goes on to say that this is not an issue that the law can resolve alone, because the law cannot change the minds of men, he points out. The law alone cannot change how we think, how we believe, and how we feel. This is an issue of morality. This is a moral issue, fundamentally a moral issue. And so with that, he reaches out to people's humanity, and he is specifically reaching out to white Americans who have been dismissing or overlooking or trying to ignore the issue altogether. And he is essentially saying, okay, if that's the case, then if you think that people shouldn't be protesting, if you think that people shouldn't be in sit-ins or marches or doing things like this, then how about you step into their experience, step into their shoes, and tell me that you'd be willing to wait. Tell me that you'd be willing to be patient. Would you be willing to tolerate this sort of treatment and these sort of odds for you or for your children because your skin color was different? And he points out that this is an issue fundamentally with our identity as a nation, right? When we talk about how Kennedy is different, what I want you to understand is Kennedy's identity in this moment is the one that people have been waiting for. This is the mindset of the new generation, that he is the guy that everybody has been waiting for, that everybody has been hoping for. And unfortunately, less than 6 months later, he is assassinated. That's the tragedy, right? In front of everyone to see, Kennedy is murdered. And as a result, you have a brand new president. And Lyndon Johnson takes over in November of 1963 as the 36th president of the United States. Now, here's the thing about Lyndon Johnson. Lyndon Johnson started his national political career as a congressman. He became a congressman from Texas in the 1930s. He was very young and became a congressman in Texas during the Roosevelt era. And he learned a lot from Franklin Roosevelt. Franklin Roosevelt really liked Lyndon Johnson and saw Lyndon Johnson as a guy who could learn very quickly on the job, and also as someone who could really campaign on Roosevelt's behalf in the House of Representatives. So Johnson learns a lot from Roosevelt. Now, does Johnson do everything that Roosevelt tells him to do? No, because eventually Johnson is going to run for the Senate seat from Texas, despite what Roosevelt tells him, and he wins the Senate seat. And he is unbelievable in the Senate. He will eventually become a Senate Majority Leader, and he knows how to get things done. In fact, if you are to look at the history of the Senate, Johnson is one of the top two, top three Senate Majority Leaders to get the most actually accomplished as a Senate Majority Leader. This guy knows how to wheel and deal. So when you compare him to Kennedy politically, Johnson is the smarter politician. Okay, he and he's had his eyes on the prize, which is the presidency. He's had his eyes on the prize for a long time. But when he runs for president in 1960, he just doesn't have the kind of charisma or the same level of appeal as John F. Kennedy. But Kennedy chooses Johnson to be his vice president because Johnson would bring in Southern support. Being the guy from Texas. And so Johnson, being asked to serve, says, okay, sure, I'll do it. This is the thing. Johnson nobody wants to be president this way. Nobody wants to become president because their president has been assassinated. Nobody wants to take over for that. And this is especially tragic. And of all the assassinations, this is particularly tragic for a few reasons. One, this is the death of the youngest president in American history. This is also the death of a president, the first president born in the 20th century. It's also, on a personal level, the death of a young father, the death of a young father of two children, right? And on top of all of that, to make things extremely traumatic, right? The entire country was an eyewitness to his death. And that had never, ever happened before. When Lincoln was assassinated or when Lincoln was shot, the eyewitnesses were there in the theater, but the story was told to everybody else. Here, it's on film. It was on television. And nobody had ever seen anything like that. Nobody had ever heard of anything like that. It was all, it was all broadcast for people to hear and see. So Johnson's greatest challenge is trying to figure out how to be president of a country that's going through this emotional trauma together. So not only is he commander-in-chief, he's counselor-in-chief, right? So as he's giving his first presidential address to both houses of Congress, there's a joint session of the Senate and the House, and he gives his first address to both of them. And he says, this is not the speech that I want to give. This is not what I want to do. I would rather, our president be up here, but now I've got to be up here, right? And he talks about the tragic loss that the country is going through. And then he talks about the dreams that John F. Kennedy had for his country, right? The vision that John F. Kennedy had for his country. And he says that John F. Kennedy's goal for this country was to reach this goal of passing the Civil Rights Bill. And he is essentially working to their grief. And he says, we are now obligated to fulfill Kennedy's vision. We are now obligated to work towards achieving this vision of making sure that his civil rights bill is achieved and set as one of his achievements, right? So he basically, when he gives this civil rights speech, or this speech on grief, he includes the Civil Rights Act, which is, a comprehensive civil rights bill. And he basically says, if you want to contribute to the legacy of John F. Kennedy, if you want to be a congressman or a senator that can sign his name to the legacy of John F. Kennedy, then you will vote for the Civil Rights Bill. Okay? You will tie yourselves to the legacy of this young, great leader's life. And that's how we can honor him forever and ever, right? There are there's a huge applause. It's a huge applause moment. But here's the thing: behind the scenes, there's a lot of complaining. There is a lot of threats from the Dixiecrats, from Southern Democrats who say, I can't believe that you're going to do this. How dare you tie John F. Kennedy to civil rights? This is a violation of everything that we stand for, and you're not a real Southerner. And here's the thing: Johnson is thoroughly called a traitor because he is a Southern white man who is campaigning for the cause of civil rights. But let me tell you something. Civil rights is a near and dear issue to Lyndon Johnson's heart, and has been for a very, very, very long time. Johnson, as a Southern white boy, grew up in areas where he saw, witnessed, heard all sorts of discriminatory things, but he was also a teacher, and he taught in poorer neighborhoods, and most of his students were Mexican, who were denied, equal access to housing and all sorts of issues on their for their own neighborhoods and that sort of thing. And what he realized is they were often the lunch programs that they had at their school were often the only meals these kids would have every day. So not only was he a witness to discriminatory policies that these children were subject to, he also saw the poverty that they had to live in. It shapes how he approaches politics. And that's on top of the fact that he sees what happens to Black Texans all the time, right? So civil rights is a huge priority for him. And so he fully embraces making civil rights his first legislative priority. And Southern Democrats everywhere else are outraged. But what ends up happening is the Civil Rights Bill, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, because it passes the very next year, just a few months later, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 is passed, of course, with some debate, but it is passed. So the Civil Rights Act of 1964, let me make sure if I have it there. There we go. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 prohibits discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. Prohibits discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. So when we talk about this Civil Rights Act, it is this sweeping civil rights bill. It's comprehensive. So it's especially going to look at hiring practices, housing practices. It's a gigantic legislative bill, which is especially problematic for Southern Democrats who are going to fight this tooth and nail. But it is looking at accessibility for people of color and Black Americans who have been denied these services, access to businesses, because when they pay for these services and then are denied equal access, that's the problem. So that's what the Civil Rights Act of 1964 is addressing. Now, there's another issue at hand that is especially important, and that's about their access to the ballot, to the polling place. Now, we had talked about this a long time ago when we talked about in the first unit, talking about discrimination in the polling place and the whole process of disenfranchisement, right? That an entire population of people had been denied their right to vote, whether it was through literacy tests or polling taxes. There are other ways of denying people their vote as well. So in 1964, there is a special movement put together by college students. And this movement is known as Freedom Summer. So Freedom Summer is especially important because it is organized by the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, And the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee worked with another college organization known as the Congress of Racial Equality, CORE. So SNCC and CORE campaigned together. They organized together to register Black voters, specifically in Mississippi. And they're trying to register voters in Mississippi to essentially motivate, get people registered to vote, but also, help them, inspire them to push them towards polling places, right? So it had gotten so bad in Mississippi that black citizens weren't even registering to vote, right? Because remember, you've got to pay if you want to vote in a lot of these places. In Freedom Summer, when we talk about how things start to, why things start to gain attention, it starts really the year before. In 1963, there had been a lot of violence unfolding in Mississippi, and a lot of this is happening without the rest of the country noticing, right? And that's because there's violence everywhere, there's protests everywhere. So over the course of the summer of 64, Freedom Summer, it's really a 10-week project, right? How do we get people registered, but also how do we get people aware of, the political issues going on, and how do we make sure that we can get, some of these voters in Mississippi, Black voters in Mississippi, as a part of something much larger, right? So we talked about Southern Democrats. Well, the Southern Democrats from Mississippi, of course, are all white. It's an all-white delegation. And the Freedom Summer activists were trying to challenge that and bring in Black representatives so they can go to the Democratic National Convention too. There are really, Freedom Summer is made up of a huge number of projects, which is why two organizations are helping to coordinate this, right? There are several dozen, like 40 something projects, and it looked at each congressional district across the state. Volunteers are in every area, so it's incredibly coordinated and organized. But here's what ends up happening, right? With all of their organization and all of this strategy, there's a lot of backlash from white Mississippians who don't want them there. So by the time the summer is over, there had been 6 known murderers, right? So 6 people we know of for sure had been murdered, 34 known shootings. 4 people had been critically wounded, for sure. At least 80 of the volunteers had been beaten. More than 1,000 people had been arrested across the state of Mississippi. The most famous murders that took place in Mississippi during Freedom Summer was the case of the 2 white men and the young Black Mississippi local who had gone there. The two white college students, of course, had been there from the north, and the young Black man there from Mississippi. The FBI got involved in that and investigated that. But in terms of the other murders and what's taking place there, the FBI did not take any kind of action and did not do anything to protect any of these civil rights workers. But what happens, though, is as a result of Freedom Summer, it puts this issue of voting rights to the front of the civil rights movement priority. And this is why this matters, for a couple of reasons, let me just say. So Martin Luther King Jr. and his generation of activists. So Martin Luther King Jr. leads an organization known as the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. And the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, also known as the SCLC, is essentially made up of ministers, right? Ministers of all denominations who are civil rights activists. But these are going to be, people who are a little bit older, professionals, right? And people who follow King, people who are with the NAACP. These are going to be professionals, right? These are going to be people who have careers, people who have families. They are sticking to a more traditional way of protest. They are going to do things that get attention, and they're going to make speeches, but they're not necessarily going to go to the most dangerous areas. They're not going to put themselves in positions where they could get hurt. Whereas these college kids, these young people will. They're willing to put their bodies on the line, their lives on the line for the sake of civil rights. And this is where these two groups clash, where young people and these slightly older professionals, right? There's a generational difference there because the older people are going to say to them, you're crazy for doing this. You're crazy for going to Mississippi and for risking your lives for voters' rights. And young people say to them, listen, if we don't do it, who will? If we don't bring attention to this, then how are we going to bring about change? And Lyndon Johnson says, yeah, they've actually got a point here because Lyndon Johnson has been wanting to do something about voting rights for a while. But the problem is he can't do it on his own. I want to point you back to what John F. Kennedy said in his speech, that the law can only do so much. It can't change the mindset of the people. And Johnson needs something to get the messaging out, not just to the people of the South. The messaging has to get to congressmen, it has to get to senators, and it has to get to the people across the country. They have to see how problematic it is to be Black in the South and just trying to vote, to participate in their democracy. Lyndon Johnson needs the participation and the contributions of a grassroots movement. If he wants to get anything done with voting rights, this is what you've got to know. He's got to have the grassroots show people how bad it is. And if the grassroots movement needs anything done and accomplished for voting rights, they need Lyndon Johnson. So this is a partnership that has to take place. So I want to show you what happens with voting rights, but it's going to focus not on Mississippi, because Mississippi doesn't get nearly as much attention as they need it to. Instead, it's going to focus on a protest that takes place in Alabama, starting with Selma, Alabama, as they march to Montgomery.
The Selma to Montgomery March is the culmination of a long struggle for voting rights that triggers a national outcry. Bloody Sunday is beamed across the nation and across the world as the forces in Alabama try to turn back the idea that Black people wanted to participate in the political process.
Now, we had the right to march from Selma to Montgomery and to be protected. The governor, the sheriff department, and others would not interfere.
The march starts in Selma, crosses the Edmund Pettus Bridge, and makes it the 54 miles up through Lowndes County.
Down Highway 80. All the way to Montgomery. And off time, we would stop to rest. Some brought food. It meant that some people were so determined to assist us.
I was 11 years old in the 6th grade, and my 6th grade class, we cleaned up at the campsite. My class was part of the cleanup crew. They camped out overnight for 4 different nights. They had a crew that would dismantle the tents, pack them up and move them up to the next campsite. They had a crew that did the same thing with the kitchen, the food, utensils and all that.
Also, there were whites who were determined to holler and discourage those persons who were white who were participating in the march.
But during the course of this campaign, even before the march is finished, Lyndon Baines Johnson takes to the airwaves before a joint session of Congress and announces that he's going to put before Congress a voting rights bill.
It was a great feeling of accomplishment, knowing that we had done something that we felt would be beneficial to all persons, regardless of their color, whether they were black, white, red, or yellow.
You felt that something great was being accomplished. You just felt that there was an enormous happiness and an enormous joy that you had finally arrived, that even though all those things had gone against you, you was finally there.
Moving down Dexter Avenue in Montgomery, to the very right marched Jose Williams, holding his daughter. I marched next to him. Mrs. King marched next to me. Dr. King marched next to his wife. Dr. Ralph Bunch, the first African-American Nobel Peace Prize winner, marched next to him. And to his right marched Mrs. Abernathy. To her right marched her husband, Ralph Abernathy. And to his right marched John Lewis, who today is the United States coming from Georgia. And to his right marched A. Philip Randolph, on the way to the Capitol to hear Dr. King make that speech that day.
It culminates with Martin Luther King's iconic speech at the steps of the state capitol, where he asks, "How long, not long?"
I sat on that platform and looked out over that sea of humanity. I don't know how many thousand people were there, but I had a feeling of great triumph and victory. For now, all persons, regardless of their color, would have a right to participate in the political process that govern their lives.
So just so you understand about this march from Selma to Montgomery, it takes place in 3 phases. So the first march took place on March 7th of 1965, and that's where 600 unarmed protesters start their march at Selma, go across the Edmund Pettus Bridge, and they're met with state troopers and what was known as the county posse men. And they had batons, they had guns, they had tear gas. And so John Lewis, who was leading this march, calls out to everybody, to the 600 protesters. And after the state troopers say to them, y'all need to turn around and go back, John Lewis says, let us kneel and pray. As they're kneeling and praying, the state troopers run at them and start beating on them. And that's what's caught on film, and that's what's sent out to television stations across the country. Some people are beaten to the point of unconsciousness, including John Lewis. But this is, it's incredibly violent and terrible. There were some people who were stomped on by horses. So the second march will take place a couple of days later, but this time it's going to include Martin Luther King Jr. Because Martin Luther King Jr. says, okay, well, if you're coming after these a march that's organized by college kids, then let me get involved too and see what happens. But that march had to be cut short because the courts got involved and said, no, you can't do a march. We're going to stop you. And interestingly enough, not interestingly, terribly, a member of their organization, a member of the civil rights protest, who was a Unitarian minister, had been murdered. So all of this takes place, all of this is gaining national attention, and that's where Lyndon Johnson steps in. And Lyndon Johnson gives this historic speech to Congress where he talks about this fundamental right of the vote, and that you cannot have a democracy where people cannot vote, right? That's the fundamental truth. And then he is essentially saying, echoing what Kennedy had said, that, if some of us are not free, then none of us are free. That's essentially what he says. And he quotes a song that civil rights activists sing all the time. And he ends up saying, "We shall overcome." And so with that, Johnson, as you saw in this clip, he federalizes the Alabama National Guard, and these protesters are protected for the entirety of their march. So the message is sent, the visuals are there, and eventually the Voting Rights Act is passed. But Johnson also says this, and this is incredibly important. Johnson says, we've lost the South forever. So he's essentially talking about how Southern Democrats are no longer going to be Democrats. They're no longer going to vote for the Democratic agenda. And he knows that because of his stance and the mainstream party's stance on the issue of civil rights. So Johnson, when he wins election on his own terms, which is in November of 1964, Johnson introduces his agenda for the country, his vision for the country, and he believes that the United States has this great unfilled potential of becoming a truly great society, a society in which it is the ultimate fulfillment of what a democracy should be, right? He believes that in a true democracy, that there are no issues when it comes to civil rights, that there is true participation in a democracy, that there is equal access to services, equal access to homes, equal access to jobs. And that is the real strength of a true great society, right? And he believes that that's the real American goal. That's the real American dream. The problem, though, he says, is that what's stopping the United States from being this great society is that we need a really big, comprehensive plan to address the real problem at the heart of the United States, what's stopping the United States from being a great society. And he says it's not racism. At the heart of America's issue is poverty. He says poverty is the great society's greatest enemy. It hinders everyone, regardless of race. There are poor white people, poor black people, poor brown people. Poverty affects everyone. And when poverty is your problem, when you are poor, you're going to look for somebody to blame. And if somebody tells you that it's the black person's fault, then of course you're going to blame the black person. Rather than fixing the problem, you're going to find somebody to blame. That's the issue, right? Which is, there is some truth to that, because if you look at Reconstruction or even look prior to the Civil War, this is the message that plantation owners give to yeoman farmers or small farmers and to poor white Southerners. Hey, at least you're superior to black Southerners. At least you're superior to enslaved people because you're white. But after slavery is over, you're going to be equal to them? Absolutely not, right? So Johnson says people who are impoverished, instead of giving them solutions, we've been giving them someone to blame, and that's not going to work. So instead, Johnson says, if we're going to get to this great society, we have to declare a war on poverty. So the war on poverty is a massive, comprehensive list of programs way more that proposes spending, government spending, which is way more than the New Deal ever proposed, and far more progressive than the New Deal ever proposed. And that's on purpose, because he thinks that while he loved and respected Franklin Roosevelt, he didn't think that Roosevelt did enough. And so these programs that he is proposing would spend billion with a B, billions of dollars on schools, billions on healthcare, billions of support on elderly and other stuff. Okay, so without going into too much detail, there are ways in which you might be familiar with the War on Poverty program. So if you've ever heard of Medicaid, Job Corps, Head Start, food stamps, which food stamps are now known as SNAP, all of those get their start in Johnson's War on Poverty. When we talk about why he pushes for Head Start, for example, what he says is, and what he campaigns for, is the fact that young kids should have opportunities to be able to, recognize important functions of being able to socialize with other kids, learning those basic social skills, learning how to develop, fine motor skills, all of that stuff in an environment that is fun and engaging. And Medicaid, of course, is designed to help those who are impoverished but need access to health care. And SNAP is, of course, designed to help people afford their groceries and basic goods. All of this stuff. Job Corps is important to help people train for specific jobs, but also get experience so that they can, it's not, designed to give them permanent careers, but at least train for them and give them opportunities to find other jobs, that find the skills that they have so that they can figure out what they want to do long term. These photographs that you see here is, I want to emphasize this because I learned about this specifically from Lyndon Johnson's wife. And just so you know, let me see if I can point her out here. So Lyndon Johnson's wife is this woman here in the hat. Lyndon Johnson, in her diaries, points out that this situation that you see here in front of you was not something that they wanted documented. They wanted to be able to visit this family and see how they lived, what they were going through, what they were dealing with. And then there were these photographers who were taking pictures that even the Johnsons thought was really intrusive. But what I want you to notice is Johnson's posture, right? Johnson has no problem getting down and talking to literally anyone and everyone, right? Because at the end of the day, Johnson was never the kind of guy who was going to be the polished politician. He was never going to be the guy who changed who he was at the core of who he was. He grew up working class, and he knew what it was like to live in poverty, and he understood the burdens of poverty. The problem, though, for Johnson is that while Johnson understood these things and Johnson had these lofty goals, Johnson also has this very strange belief that he can do everything at all times. And that's going to be an issue for him. In the meantime, there is a change that's happening among the civil rights movement. So I told you that there is a generational divide in the civil rights movement. I want to comment on that very quickly. In this generational divide, you start to see in the mid-1960s that there are protests and riots that are taking place in larger cities. So we're talking about Los Angeles and Detroit especially, but they are happening in places where essentially you start to see areas where there are huge wealth gaps, where black neighborhoods don't have the same access to public services as white neighborhoods. And so young people in particular are pushing back against this. And when we talk about the mid 1960s, what is especially important is that this is the time and the rise of a new voice in civil rights activism, and that's this gentleman right here. That's Malcolm X. So Malcolm X is significant here because he is someone who had been born and raised in a time where, so he's born in Nebraska technically, but he lives his life in Detroit or in the Midwest, and then he's arrested, and during his time in jail, he becomes a Muslim. And here's the thing, like he had lived in a different series of foster homes and with different relatives because his father, who was a minister, his father had been brutally murdered, and his mother had gone through a variety of issues dealing with depression and that sort of thing. And so Malcolm X had been shipped off to all sorts of different places, had a very difficult time growing up. And so as he got older, he, committed different crimes and that sort of thing. So starting in the late 1940s, like 1946, 47, something like that, he was sentenced to prison. And that's when he joined the Nation of Islam, which is a specific group, a specific sect of the Muslim nation, Muslim belief system, and changed his name to Malcolm X officially. And so then what happens after he gets parole in 1952 is he starts to move up in leadership in the Nation of Islam. And then as he starts to move up in his organization, by the 1960s, he becomes much more vocal and much more significant on a national level outside of the Nation of Islam for the causes of the civil rights movement. But the thing is that when we talk about how he becomes active, or the things that he says, he starts to advocate for a much more aggressive approach to civil rights. He denounces what Martin Luther King says. He says that King is someone who tries to appease white America, that King is too passive in his approach for civil rights, that he is trying to be too kind, that his use of love and peace and peaceful protests are not doing enough. And instead, you have to take your civil rights by force if necessary, right? Now, this is the thing. Malcolm X is going to change his tune eventually. He is going to take a trip. He's going to take, the Hajj, which is the trip to the Holy Land, to Mecca, in which when he goes to Mecca, he sees people of all races going and praying at Mecca, which changes his perspective entirely. And then he takes another trip across Africa. And when he does this, he renounces the Nation of Islam and he establishes his own organization. And this changes his perspective, and he realizes, okay, maybe it doesn't have to be as aggressive as I thought it did, which is what allows for this one and only meeting between the two men, Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. Does he agree with everything King says after he comes back from Africa? No, but he's not going to push this idea of violence either. However, one of the things that happens as a result of Malcolm X is you start to see more young people embracing the idea of separating themselves from Martin Luther King Jr. and the SCLC and this older generation, this older approach to the civil rights movement. And you start to see the rise of what's known as the Black Power movement. Black Power movement is essentially made up of young people who and this is going to be led by SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. By the time it becomes this, John Lewis leaves the organization and others leave the organization because this is not what they wanted. But SNCC essentially kicks out white members and decides to fully embrace this idea that they will be an entirely Black organization because what they decide their identity as an organization is going to be is that they will be a Black organization that 100% embraces the Black identity, that you should be proud of being Black, and that it is that Black people were worthy of and they were capable of being and doing anything, but that also meant that Black people could only depend on other Black people to save their communities. So when we talk about things like the Black Panther movement, more often than not, Black Panthers are known as a group that advocated violence. But the other thing that Black Panthers do is they create daycare centers, they raise money, they donate food, they do all sorts of things, but they specifically focus on Black communities. They do nothing for anything beyond that. And they do it specifically because they believe that nobody else is going to help them, nobody else is going to support them. When we look at Malcolm X and Black Power in particular, there are two significant things that I want you to remember about both, okay? Malcolm X and Black Power, first and foremost, point out that racism is not just a Southern issue, right? It's the same thing that JFK points out. And that is, listen, these are issues that are happening in Detroit, Los Angeles, New York, Boston, which is widely considered, even to this day, one of the most, if not the most racist city in the United States. It is a significant issue across the country. It is truly an American problem. And this is something that Martin Luther King Jr. Had not recognized. Like, Kennedy's not going to say that, but Malcolm X and Black Power absolutely call out Martin Luther King and the SCLC for that, because King and the SCLC only focus on the South. They've only been campaigning on the South. And what these guys say is, well, okay, fine, the South has a problem, but when are you guys going to come out here and point out these issues? Because it's not just a Southern issue. The South is where it's the most obvious, maybe, but there are economic issues that are drawn along racial lines as well that maybe you should start paying attention to. The second thing that Malcolm X and the Black Power movement does is it revolutionized how African Americans viewed themselves across the country. You start to see more Black Americans embracing their identity as Black people, seeking out what their identities are, going back to African nations, wanting to learn more about their history, even trying to trace as much history back to their enslaved ancestors as possible, fully embracing their history and embracing who they are as a people, and being proud of that, rather than trying to fit into a larger society that Malcolm X says over and over again they will never accept you, right? Now, this goes to and points to what's happening on a larger scale for a lot of young people across the country, right? So remember, I told you about Lyndon Johnson and, how he wants to get rid of poverty in the United States. So he introduces all of these billions of dollars worth of programs. Well, the biggest problem for Lyndon Johnson is that Johnson believes that he can solve all of America's problems, that he is truly a superhero, right? And that not only can he fix poverty, but he can also win America's battle against communism. He really can't, obviously. And what makes it worse is the situation unfolding in Vietnam. By 1960, Vietnam had become a much bigger mess, and France was starting to back out of Vietnam because they could not handle it. And of course, the American leadership had been reaching out to France and saying, well, that's because you're not listening to us. Eisenhower sent you advisors and you're not listening to our advisors. But the reality is that it had nothing to do with the advisors. This was an issue. This was an issue that couldn't be resolved. Remember, this was a lesson that we should have learned after Korea. We're not talking about territory here. When people are fighting for a principle instead of a territory, the people fighting for a principle are going to last a lot longer. We should know that from our own history. Americans were fighting against the big bad empire of the British. The British had been the biggest, baddest, most powerful empire in the world at that time. And here are these 13 measly colonies trying to fight back against that empire, not over territory, but over the principle of independence. If that's possible, then certainly this is possible now. And what starts to happen is Johnson, rather than saying, okay, France, well, if you don't want to keep fighting, then we're out. You guys can go and be embarrassed if that's what you want to do, and we're going to back out too. We're going to take our money and run. Instead, what Johnson does is Johnson escalates things. There's a claim of an attack on an American ship just in the Gulf of Tonkin, which is just outside of Vietnam. And that's what launches what would be known as the Vietnam War. As we start this war, there is a large anti-war movement that begins. And this is what I want you to understand that Johnson is dealing with. You cannot spend billions of dollars on an anti-poverty program and spend billions of dollars, or at least millions of dollars, on a war. You can't do both. You have to pick one or the other, right? Which is already going to get Johnson in trouble. What makes it worse is that you have a generation of young people who don't agree with this war to begin with. And what makes it even more complicated is that the Johnson administration asks Congress to institute the draft. And so now we are asking young people to join in a war that they don't want to fight in. And a lot of people don't even understand why we're fighting in this war to begin with. It is a war, it is a movement that grows and grows and grows, and it won't stop growing. In addition to that, there's another movement that seems to stem from that, known as the free speech movement. And these are going to be young people, college-age students, who are going to protest for their right to protest. Students for a Democratic Society, which starts in the early 1960s. These are, again, baby boomers, who are now, grandparents, basically. Baby boomers are going to protest on their college campuses. They're going to lock themselves in their dean's offices and protest for the right to free speech, the protection for their rights to free speech, because they believe that they don't have the kinds of opportunities to be able to freely express themselves and do so in criticism, particularly of American domestic and foreign policies. These protests are happening regularly. They're happening across the country. They're happening on streets. They're happening on college campuses. So imagine you have protests happening in the South and in larger cities for the cause of civil rights. And you also have protests that are happening across college campuses for the anti-war and free speech movement. And then on top of that, you have more movements that are emerging, right? There's the women's rights movement that is born out of a couple of things. There is a book that is published that is called the Feminine Mystique, written by a woman named Betty Friedan. When we talk about the feminine mystique, this is actually published in 1963, and the feminine mystique argues, let me go back for a second. The feminine mystique argues that women who are told that they need to stay home and be housewives and stay-at-home moms are actually really miserable. And they want to seek out their purpose in something other than being stay-at-home moms and housewives. You're going to see in the 1960s the establishment of the National Organization for Women. Now will campaign regularly for equal pay, for laws that protect women from not only discrimination, but most especially for harassment, in the workplace and that sort of thing. When we talk about harassment in the workplace, women are subject to harassment on the daily, and there was no such thing as Title IX. There's no such thing that protects them from this sort of behavior and treatment, and they were paid significantly less than their male counterparts. The other thing that you should keep in mind here too is that, in the 1960s, women were not allowed to have their own credit cards. Women are not allowed to have their own bank accounts. Women were not allowed to, sign for their own property. It always had to be, authorized by a male member of their family, their husbands, their fathers, and somebody else. And so, but somebody who was a man, right? So the National Organization for Women will start to campaign for, organize for women's equality in that way. For women to have access to those things, those basic rights, there are protests organized as a result. And that's what we mean by women's liberation, the idea that women had to liberate themselves from these ideas that kept them in these sort of boxes, these limits of what a woman should and should not be, right? That a woman had to, was not capable of doing certain jobs, was not capable of understanding finances, was not capable of owning property, breaking free from that sort of ideology. Another result of this is, of course, going to be the Supreme Court case of Roe v. Wade in 1973. We'll talk a little bit more about the long-term effects of this in the next lecture, but Roe v. Wade in 1973 is a huge moment for the women's movement because essentially the message here is that women were able to have the decision-making power. Women and their doctors would be able to make decisions over their bodies without permission from or decisions made by their husbands. This happens to this day, by the way, but regularly prior to this, women even making decisions about whether or not they wanted to have children or going on things like birth control that was a decision that had to be made by their husbands. So even if birth control was seen as a method to help them with hormones and that sort of thing, it did not matter. It had to happen with the permission of their husbands. In other words, women were not seen as human beings on their own. Their humanity was tied to a male authority. And this is not just a recognition of access to healthcare. This is a recognition of women as their own entities, right? Then there's the movement of gay liberation and gay rights. And a lot of this is born out of what happens at Stonewall in New York. So when we talk about Stonewall, the Stonewall riots, that take place in 1969, Stonewall is actually the Stonewall riots are really a spontaneous series of riots that take place. There was a police raid that took place at the Stonewall Inn, which is in Greenwich Village in New York City. This is not the first time that members of the gay community fight back against open persecution of gay people or the gay community. But it is this sort of pivotal moment in gay history and for the LGBTQ movement, which that's not what they're known as in the 1960s. In the 1960s, it's described as gay liberation or, different terminology. But essentially, this moment and this movement begins as a result of trans people who are fighting back against police raids. And it sort of inspires this movement across the country for people of the LGBTQ community to fight back, right? And really sort of take pride in their own identity. Latino activism is interesting too, because Chicano power is actually sort of a step from Black power in that they are embracing this identity for themselves. This is largely going to happen in California. In the 1960s, you have Latino activists who are campaigning for workers' rights, especially. This is especially important for Cesar Chavez, who was a civil rights activist and a labor leader. And there's Dolores Huerta as well. They are going to sort of inspire young people to get involved in Latino activism and establish what's known as Chicano power. And then, of course, among young Native people who will push for the American Indian movement. Young people in indigenous communities are also going to be quite in your face about indigenous rights and indigenous identity in particular. So there will be the occupation of Alcatraz, which is the island right outside of San Francisco. Alcatraz had been, of course, a place where they held prisoners. And a group of young people identified with the American Indian movement will occupy the island. This is in the early 1970s, in which they say that they are making demands for ownership of the land in exchange for beads that they are willing to provide for the American president. There's a lot of tongue-in-cheek sarcasm there. What I want you to understand is it's not just one movement. It's not just one revolution. It's not just one opportunity to stand up against this sort of set ideas of what it is or what it means to be an American, right? And it's a backlash against this 1950s image of the perfect American family and the perfect American ideal system. That's what's happening here. And so when we talk about why these revolutions are taking place, there is a purpose, right? They're fighting back for the cause of their own identity and to be able to be who they are freely and openly. But it's also a pushback against this idea that this middle-class white family living in the suburbs is supposed to be the standard for Americanism, right? But that leads me to what is probably the most significant, the most pivotal year of the 1960s. And that's saying something because the entire decade is quite dramatic. So 1968 is a year of turmoil. Starting in January with the Tet Offensive. So Tet is the Vietnamese New Year, and because it's a holiday, a truce was called in Vietnam. But what ends up happening is North Vietnamese forces launched a surprise attack against the American military forces and against South Vietnamese forces. It's a surprise attack. The Americans don't see them coming. And eventually, the Americans and the South Vietnamese beat back the North Vietnamese. But North Vietnamese make some serious gains here, right? There are some serious victories here in that, one, they were able to successfully launch the attack, and two, they are able to make some major dents in in American capabilities, also South Vietnamese capabilities, and three, this is a huge victory in morale for the North Vietnamese. For the North Vietnamese, they see this as, hey, we were able to take on the superpower of the world and we surprised them. They didn't see us coming. And here's the thing that you have to understand about the Vietnam War, right? This is an entirely different war, right? You're not fighting in ditches behind barbed wire like you were in World War I. This is not lines of men who are storming beaches. This is an entirely different war that is fought in jungles, that is guerrilla warfare. So these are regular people that are showing up randomly and blowing things up. You don't really know who the enemy is because the enemy doesn't always dress up in military uniform. Sometimes the enemy is dressed up in regular clothes and takes you out just like that. This is not a typical war. And so after the Tet Offensive, when momentum shows that it's clearly on the side of the North Vietnamese, it's also clear that Lyndon Johnson has lost the support of the majority of Americans and even the American media. There are members of the media who are just outright showing criticism for the president. And this is important because in 1968, we are talking about a presidential election year. And Johnson is the presumed Democratic nominee because he is the sitting president. One of the things you need to know, though, is Johnson really struggles with this idea of being president. After serving his first year as president, after John F. Kennedy was assassinated, he actually seriously thought that he would not run for president in 1964. I mean, it was something very deeply debated for him. There was a thought that, you know what, this job is too much. There's a lot more to do than I would like. Maybe I should just go home. I mean, he battled very deep bouts of depression and thought that this job was going to make it worse, which it did. So he went back and forth on it. By the time 1968 comes and, you know, the country is protesting so loudly against him in particular, like they're specifically targeting him, he decides in March of 1968 to announce that he will not run for re-election. He says, even if the Democratic Party was to nominate me for the presidency, I would turn it down. This is the thing. Johnson needs the support of people. He thrives on the support of people. And when it's clear he doesn't have it, and on top of that, there's nothing within him that is pushing him forward, he really struggles with that. So what he decides to do is from March of 1968 until January of 69, when his term is officially over, he dedicates the remainder of his presidency to end the Vietnam War. That's the most important focus for him. He nearly does that, but then those plans are sort of upended, and we'll talk about how in the next lecture. So the other thing that happens in 1968, again, I just want to emphasize this. This is in April of 1968. Actually, before I get to Martin Luther King Jr., let me just say, after Johnson makes his announcement, there are Democrats springing up everywhere who announce that they're going to run for president. So the Democrats at that point have 5 people who are running for president. They announce their campaigns, 5, which to us now seems like nothing because we have like 20, 25 people who announce that they're running, 3 years in advance. So 5 people in 1968 seems like a lot because it is a lot in 1968. So that's the reaction. And then, of course, in April of 1968, so literally just a few weeks later, Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. is assassinated in just before he is supposed to give or supposed to lead a protest. The protest that he's about to lead is actually for workers' rights, janitorial workers' rights. And when we talk about why this is important and why this matters so much, so he's assassinated in Tennessee just before this janitorial workers protest. He's doing this because he, in the last year or so, had been starting to protest on more things than just civil rights. So the young people and Black Power and Malcolm X had really pushed him to pay attention to things that were happening outside of the civil rights movement, right? So now he started to look at things like the wealth gap. He was looking at the issues for working class people and issues of poverty. And that's why he's now campaigning on workers' rights, right? Like he was making comments on what's going on in the Vietnam War and why it's so problematic and stuff. And what really pushes him towards becoming more vocal about these things is the fact that Malcolm X is assassinated in 1965, and King realizes, okay, there really does need to be a voice on these issues. So on April 3rd, 1968, the night before this march, he gives this speech, of which I want to play just a couple of minutes.
All we say to America is be true to what you said on paper. If I lived in China or even Russia or any totalitarian country, maybe I could understand some of these illegal injunctions. Maybe I could understand the denial of certain basic First Amendment privileges because they haven't committed themselves to that over there. But somewhere I read of the freedom of assembly. Somewhere I read of the freedom of speech. Somewhere I read of the freedom of press. Somewhere I read that the greatness of America is the right to protest for rights. And so just as I say we aren't going to let any dogs or water hoses turn us around, we aren't going to let any injunction turn us around. Well, I don't know what will happen now. We've got some difficult days ahead. But it really doesn't matter with me now because I've been to the mountaintop. I don't mind. Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place. But I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And He's allowed me to go up to the mountain. And I've looked over and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. So I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord.
So less than 24 hours later, Martin Luther King Jr. would be shot and assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee, at the age of 39 years old. King, interestingly enough, in this speech, talks about how he may not get to the promised land with them. And it's eerily eerily telling about what he knows is at risk, how he knows that his life is in the balance here for what he is doing, right? And that night, the next day on April 4th, after King's assassination news spreads, Robert F. Kennedy, who is one of the candidates for the Democratic nomination, Robert F. Kennedy has been campaigning at this point to different areas across the country, and he lands in Indianapolis for a campaign event and says this.
Do they know about Martin Luther King? Could you lower those signs, please? I have some very sad news for all of you, and that is that Martin Luther King was shot and was killed tonight in Memphis. Martin Luther King dedicated his life to love and to justice between fellow human beings. He died in the cause of that effort. In this difficult day, in this difficult time for the United States, it's perhaps well to ask what kind of a nation we are and what direction we want to move in. For those of you who are black, considering the evidence evidently is that there were white people who were responsible, you can be filled with bitterness and with hatred and a desire for revenge. We can move in that direction as a country, in greater polarization, black people amongst blacks and white amongst whites, filled with hatred toward one another. Or we can make an effort, as Martin Luther King did, to understand and to comprehend and replace that violence, that stain of bloodshed that is spread across our land, with an effort to understand compassion and love. For those of you who are black and are tempted to be filled with hatred and mistrust of the injustice of such an act against all white people, I would only say that I can also feel in my own heart the same kind of feeling. I had a member of my family killed, but he was killed by a white man. But we have to make an effort in the United States. We have to make an effort to understand, to get beyond or go beyond these rather difficult times. My favorite poem, my favorite poet was Aeschylus. He once wrote, "Even in our sleep, pain which cannot forget falls drop by drop upon the heart, until in our own despair, against our will, comes wisdom through the awful grace of God." What we need in the United States is not division. What we need in the United States is not hatred. What we need in the United States is not violence and lawlessness, but is love and wisdom and compassion toward one another, feeling of justice toward those who still suffer within our country, whether they be white or whether they be black. We can do well in this country. We will have difficult times. We've had difficult times in the past, but we will have difficult times in the future. It is not the end of violence. It is not the end of lawlessness, and it's not the end of disorder. But the vast majority of white people and the vast majority of black people in this country want to live together, want to improve the quality of our life, and want justice for all human beings that abide in our land. With and what dedicate ourselves to what the Greeks wrote so many years ago, to tame the savageness of man and make gentle the life of this world. Let us dedicate ourselves to that and say a prayer for our country and for our people. Thank you.
So Robert Kennedy gives the speech in Indianapolis, and what's important about that is after King's assassination news travels across the country, race riots break out in cities across the country, except for in Indianapolis. Kennedy's message is incredibly important and moving. Kennedy becomes a candidate for the working class. He's a candidate for minorities, for young people. He represents the guy that challenges mainstream Democratic thinking, a forward-thinking candidate, right? That he believes in fulfilling what John F. Kennedy left behind, the potential of the 1963 version of John F. Kennedy. And unfortunately, in June of 1968, Robert F. Kennedy would be assassinated on the ground of. Wait a second. He would be assassinated in the hotel of a California campaign location where he had just given a victory speech after winning the primary there. In 1968, in the summer of 1968, after a lot of violence and a lot of trauma, especially among the Democrats, the question becomes, where do we go from here? How do we recover? How do we recover as a nation? How do we recover as a generation? What is in front of us now? Well, on the other side of the political aisle, there's a guy named Richard Milhous Nixon. And he's got some ideas and some suggestions that he'd like to share with you.